I want to apologize up front in case any background noise interferes with this podcast. I'm sitting on my front porch, and I'm doing an improvisational podcast because several things that I've been seeing on Facebook and things on video and the news have triggered something that I just want to make an improvisational response to. In some of the testimonies on the January 6th committee, many of the Capitol Police came in, some large, muscular men, breaking down in tears, talking about how they suffered from PTSD, nervous nightmares, talking about how they feared for their life on January 6th. It actually left me with a feeling of, I don't know how to really express it except disdain for those people. This is another broadcast of Sword of Truth, seeking to bring to you the truth out of today's news, to reveal the truth that you won't get from the media, the internet, government reports, from social media, and other sources, to bring the truth to you without anything other than maybe my personal opinion, but based on observation and experience. I have a long background. I'm over 70 years old, and I'm retired military, and I'm combat arms infantry. When I watched those people in the January 6th committee testifying, and I saw those men and women that were serving in the Capitol Police crying and whining about the stress they were under, I had no sympathy for it. They were supposed to be trained police officers doing the job. But to me, they were acting like little children that were being, breaking down because they had actually been expected to do what they were paid to do. Let me take you back in time a little bit. When I graduated from Officer Candidate School at Fort Benning in 1970, I was assigned to the 3rd United States Infantry called the Old Guard in Washington, D.C. I was there in 1970 and 71, and during that time, there were two very large-scale student demonstrations protesting the Vietnam War. In both years, around the springtime, hundreds of thousands of students came to D.C. and protested. And in one of those demonstrations, they believed to be well over 500,000, possibly up to 1 million students marching on the Capitol building and specifically on the White House. It was so bad, or anticipated to be so bad, that they brought the 82nd Airborne Division in from Fort Bragg, North Carolina to reinforce the military and police authorities in Washington, D.C. They placed capital city buses nose to end, all the way around the White House to prevent them from getting through. And behind the buses, between the buses and the fences, they had platoon after platoon of capital city police waiting in case they broke through. And beyond that, the military was waiting that if they came over the wall, we were there to stop them. I had friends that were serving in the Capitol Police. And I know from personal observation and from the stories they told me that those students pushed those buses over, came across, and beat the holy living crap out of some of those police, put many of them in the hospital, some even in intensive care. And I know some of them were beaten because one of the ones that I was friends with, I saw the abuse on his body, on his face, and some of the bruises on his body. And he told me that of over 40 people he went online with, he was only one of about 5 or 6 that actually walked away that day that didn't go to a hospital. Yet they were still able to stop them from getting over the fence. And those people didn't walk away whining and sniveling anyway, like the ones at the January 6th. I served in Vietnam in combat with guys from about 18 on up, and we faced sometimes almost on a daily basis, but quite frequently, being combat infantry, we faced people who were shooting at us, trying to kill us, blowing us up, people dying, bodies blown to pieces, losing friends close to us, and I didn't hear the whining and sniveling from the people I served with that I heard from those Capitol Police who faced a bunch of unarmed civilians trying to get into the Capitol building. Now, I know it had to be a scary moment for them at some point, but it just makes me wonder what was really going on and what was behind those testimonies. If those people were really feeling as bad as they did, my comment is they shouldn't be on the police force. They were untrained, unprepared psychologically. They were untrained, unprepared tactically. And quite frankly, they should be relieved of their duty. They shouldn't be overly compensated because they weren't capable of doing their job. And while it may not be true, I suspect many of them were what they call DEI people. They were hired under DEI policies, that they weren't really qualified. They were just given the job because. The only people I know of that were actually injured unnecessarily or killed during that was a woman from California who was murdered trying to get into an office, and it took until Trump got into office this time before she was recognized and any compensation was paid to her family. Yet everybody's trying to bow down to these poor officers who were under such stress. I'm sorry, but that's the job. And I have great disdain for people who sign up to do a job and then when they're expected to do the job, they panic and whine and snivel like a 5-year-old. A lot of people say I'm narrow-minded, and I'm going to say I am, because I have lived a tough life in some ways. I'm not Mr. Hero, so to speak, but I have lived a life that some people would consider a tough life in the difficulties that I've gone through, choosing to go in the Army when I was a teenager, and choosing to go in the infantry specifically, and having come up with airborne and special forces and going into combat. That's not exactly a road the average person takes. But I've seen a lot of high-stress situations, and I've seen a lot of people, different ages and different backgrounds, all ethnic backgrounds, in high-stress situations. And when I see people like these Capitol Police testifying, it just, I say it just raises up a spirit of disdain in me, that they're in there whining and sniveling because all I see them doing is trying to get some kind of compensation. Oh, poor me. I got hired on to be a tour guide, not to be a policeman, and when you actually had to do the job, I couldn't take it. It was too much for me. I need lifetime compensation now because I actually had to do the job you hired me to do. And really, in society, I see that so many times, it bothers me. In Uvalde, Texas, when the children were being gunned down inside the classroom, the person in charge of the police force actually held off the officers from going in the restroom for over an hour because he couldn't make up his mind what to do. He's obviously incompetent to do his job. And I'm not blaming him for their death because it's the shooters that did the job. But why are you afraid to do your job? You train to do the job. You prepare to do the job. And you're there to respond to a critical situation. So many times in mass shootings events, especially in school events, people have hesitated, delayed, and failed to go in and do the job they're paid for. This is what happened in southern Florida with one of the school resource officers. And everybody patted him on the butt and said, oh, poor guy, we don't blame him. It wasn't his fault. Well, that's what he was hired to do. Well, I don't expect to bring charges on him, but I don't expect to reward him either. When you sign up to do a job, you sign up to do what that job calls for. If you can't do that job, you shouldn't be there. If you're a security guard or a security officer in a school, a mall, a police force, or whatever, it calls for certain things which are going to require you to, when the shots are fired, you have to run to the sound of the shots. You have to go in and rescue people. Not long ago, near where I live, here in Georgia, out near a town called Winder, a school shooter went in and opened fire on some of his classmates, and he killed 4 people and wounded 8 or 9. I will have to say the police force that responded here are some of the finest police officers I've seen. They did not hesitate. They went in and they charged in, and they stopped the melee as fast as anyone I've ever seen, because they ran to the sounds of the gun, and they stopped that little bugger fast. They were trained. They did what they're supposed to do, and they should be highly commended because they were doing the job that they were paid to do. This brief podcast is here just to express my opinion about how I feel about the January 6th committee, the investigation, and the Capitol Police that got up there and whined and sniveled and portrayed themselves as victims. They aren't victims. They're incompetents. And I'm sorry that they had to go through that, but that's what you were being paid for. And the fact that you actually had to do your job, guess what, Bubba? A lot of us have to do that. I signed up in the Army as an infantryman. I trained for several years in infantry. And then they sent me to Vietnam. And guess what? I had to do my job. I got shot at. I got wounded. I saw people die around me. I had to do my job. I couldn't run back to Mama. I couldn't stick my thumb in my mouth and suck on it and hide in the corner. Oh my gosh, I actually have to do my job. I didn't come back to the States and whine and say, oh, I need to be patted on the head. I was exposed. And neither did all the thousands and thousands of men that served with me. If you want PTSD, you need to be somewhere very serious. And PTSD is something that you don't just get and go in and confess before a committee like the January 6th committee. It's something that sits there in the back of your mind, like hazardous waste, and begins to leak into your system after having seen things like people blown to pieces, like having suffered and seen children butchered by an enemy, or families torn apart and killed, and fathers butchered because they didn't stand up and join an enemy force, villages burned down, things that will leave you in trauma, not because some little tourist there to stand up at a mild protest for the president came into the Capitol and wanted to go see where the Speaker of the House desk was at. I may sound a little radical and being too hard and too harsh, but that's the way I feel, and I think I probably speak for a lot of other American citizens, that they have overplayed this January 6th too much. It wasn't an insurrection. It was a few protesters that came up there to protest what they thought was an unfair election, and they got out of hand, and they went into the Capitol building, and they did some destruction. And maybe they should have been fined and chastised for what they did, but they were not an insurrection, and they should not have been sent to prison for 10, 15, 20 years or longer. They should have been given punishment, but nothing like what they were. And the people involved, like the Capitol Police, they weren't a victim. They were as much a part of it as anything else. That's my opinion. That's what the Sword of Truth has to say on this subject. And that's the last you'll hear of it from me. As always, I ask you to think open-mindedly, to think critically, but most importantly, to think for yourself. So that's it for this one. God bless you. And thankfully, we're moving into a new era in this country where we are truly going to make America great again.